And you mentioned, premarital agreements. Could you share a bit on the prenup, postnup thing? Like, kind of explain the basics for guys?
Yeah. So I think that a lot of guys, premarital agreements, I mean, we hear Kanye West, holler, we want prenup. And, there's a reason for it. And they're becoming more and more common, and they're in the news all the time. I mean, Dr. Dre just killed it with the Super Bowl and, halftime show here in the United States. And I mean, he's going through a contested prenup with his wife. And we hear about, Donald Trump having a bulletproof, prenup. And so we hear about it, but really talking about what it is a different thing. And it's essentially an agreement in writing where you and your spouse agree ahead of time on a division of property and or the amount of spousal support and potentially attorney's fees. Generally speaking, you cannot pre-agree about what's going to happen with the kids. And that's because, let's say Dr. Dre and his wife sign an agreement in California, and then 10 years later, she has, and they agree that they're going to, that she's going to get the kids all the time. Well, what if she has like an alcohol issue and she's just, batshit crazy? It's just not good for the kids. So, agreements on what's going to happen with custody and then also child support, those are generally not enforceable, but it's an agreement that is ultimately a contract, but it's a special kind of contract. And we can talk about the hoops and the things that you need that go into that contract in terms of making it enforceable. So there's not necessarily a bulletproof prenup. They're oftentimes attacked. Dr. Dre being, a prime example. And there's, examples all across. I mean, these celebrities we hear, and they're kind of fodder for the tabloids, but they often are attacked. And so guys should know what goes into a marital agreement or premarital agreement in order to ensure that there's a high degree of enforceability.
And just at a high level, like what kinds of things can be included in there?
Well, if you own a business, so if you're Eric Wolf or, any of your guys are a business owner, what you can do, most states will recognize that property that was owned at the time of marriage is separate property. States can vary on what happens to that separate property during the marriage. So for example, in Colorado, any appreciation on that separate property. So if, a guy owns a business and it's worth, $5 million when they get married, then if it's, $7 million when they go through a divorce, the $5 million is set aside as separate property, but the $2 million, is considered marital. In New York, California, they treat it a little bit differently. But in a marital agreement, you can say, for example, that the business is your separate property, including the appreciation, including the gains. You can also have, various provisions on what's going to happen, if you buy a house or if you have kids. And so, those are certain, things you essentially kind of agree ahead of time as to what is going to happen in the event of a divorce. Another method or another common motivation behind premarital agreement and marital agreement, and I'll go back and kind of define that because I think that's kind of helpful to know, is that if you have kids from another marriage, you can provide for them instead of, most states will have kind of, if you die, that, your property generally goes to your spouse, and you can kind of dictate what happens in that circumstance. So, a second marriage can really kind of be an avenue or a way for you to kind of say that you're going to provide for your kids instead of your wife, your second wife, and so those are common mechanisms that you can do. But I think it's helpful when I say marital agreement and premarital agreement. Prenup, premarital agreement, it's an agreement that you do before you get married. and they're recognized across the United States, and I assume in Canada. And you have to jump through some hoops in order for them to be enforceable. A marital agreement is something that you can agree during the marriage. So after you get married, the provisions and the hoops that you have to jump through are generally similar. And so sometimes if, for example, if money is becoming, an issue in your marriage where you guys are fighting over money, she's just draining you of all your money. You can agree in that circumstance in a marital agreement as to what is going to happen. And that might alleviate some of the stress. That might ameliorate some of the disputes. And then, you can say, hey, I'm really kind of committed to this marriage now that my financial issues or financial concerns have been addressed. And if you do get a divorce, then that marital agreement will dictate, if it's enforceable, what happens to that business or what happens in certain circumstances. But again, as I said before, the laws on enforceability of a marital agreement and premarital agreement kind of vary across the country. They are becoming a little bit more uniform, but it depends on where you are.